Late December 1944, the Ardennes forest. For a German infantryman huddled in his frozen foxhole, the high-pitched whistle of incoming American artillery is a familiar, terrifying sound. He flattens himself against the cold earth, waiting for the familiar ground burst, the thud, the tremor, the sideways spray of steel. But the impact never comes. Instead, a sharp crack splits the air directly above him. A steel rain of shrapnel pours down, a vertical storm that no trench or foxhole can stop. It's an attack from an impossible angle. All along the front, the sky itself has become the weapon. What the German infantry experienced was not a fluke. It was the battlefield debut of one of the war's most sensitive secrets, the proximity fuse. A tiny radio, transmitter, and receiver packed into the nose of an artillery shell, programmed to detonate not on impact, but in the air above its target. This technology had the potential to be a game changer. So the real question is not what it was, but why it was held back for so long. What crisis was so profound that Allied command was finally forced to risk its capture in the frozen forests of the Ardennes? To understand that risk, we must go back to the morning of December 16, 1944. In the Ardennes forest, a sector considered so quiet it was used to rest tired American divisions, 3 German armies launched a massive surprise offensive. Over 250,000 soldiers and 1,000 tanks smashed into the thinly held American lines. Almost immediately, the Allies lost their greatest advantage, their eyes in the sky. The worst winter in 40 years descended upon Europe, a blanket of thick fog, low clouds, and blinding snowstorms. The formidable Allied tactical air forces, the fighter bombers that had dominated the skies since D-Day, were grounded. On the forest floor, the American soldier was suddenly blind and alone. The German plan, Wacht am Rhein, was designed for these exact conditions. It wasn't a simple frontal assault. Elite SS Panzer divisions and Volksgrenadier infantry were not meant to fight for every town. Their orders were to infiltrate, to flow through gaps in the American lines like water, bypassing strong points to seize critical bridges and fuel dumps deep in the rear. This created a tactical nightmare for American defenders. Their doctrine relied on a wall of artillery fire to break up enemy attacks. But the standard artillery shell, armed with a point-detonating fuse, was proving shockingly ineffective. In the dense forest, shells would often strike a tree branch and explode harmlessly high above the enemy, a phenomenon called a tree burst. In open ground, the deep snow and soft, muddy earth would swallow the projectile, muffling the blast and directing most of the shrapnel uselessly into the sky. For German infantry dug into frozen foxholes, the American king of battle had lost its terrifying power. As reports of collapsing positions flooded Supreme Headquarters, it became clear a strategic disaster was unfolding. The Allies' most powerful conventional weapon was failing. With their air power neutralized and their artillery struggling to make an impact, Allied commanders were forced to consider a radical, high-stakes gamble they had forbidden for years. The forbidden weapon was codenamed the VT fuse, for variable time. Developed in absolute secrecy since 1940, under the direction of scientist Vannevar Bush, it was originally designed to defend the U.S. Navy from air attack. The Joint Chiefs of Staff had issued a strict standing order. The fuse was never to be used over land. The reason was a strategic nightmare. If a single dud shell fell into German hands, the secret could be compromised. Reverse engineered, the technology could then be turned against the vast Allied bomber fleets flying over Germany, threatening the entire strategic bombing campaign. But by December 19th, with American lines verging on collapse, the immediate crisis outweighed the long-term risk. At Supreme Headquarters, General Dwight D. Eisenhower made the call. He authorized the release of the VT fuses for use against ground targets. The authorization, however, was not a blank check. The fuses were to be fired only in massed barrages, to minimize the chance of a dud being found, and only in the most desperate sectors. The order was signed. But an order from headquarters is not a shell in the breech of a gun. Now began a frantic, secret race to get this revolutionary munition to the batteries on the front line, before that line ceased to exist. The order was a spark. Now it had to ignite a fire. Across Britain and France, in heavily guarded ordnance depots, a frantic logistical scramble began. Men were sent to retrieve specific wooden crates, marked not with VT fuse, but with the innocuous code POZIT. These were not ordinary munitions. They were moved under armed guard, loaded onto priority trucks. Drivers were given stark, simple orders. You do not stop for anything. If capture is imminent, you destroy your cargo. On the icy roads leading to the Ardennes, these secret convoys joined the desperate race to reinforce the crumbling front. At the artillery batteries, the fuses arrived in the dead of night. Battalion commanders were given sealed instructions. The documents were brief, almost cryptic. They explained how to set the new fuse, a simple twist, but offered no explanation of how it worked. The gunners, accustomed to the precise calculations of timed fuses, were simply told to aim for the center of a target area. The shell, they were promised, would do the rest. For the artillerymen working in the frozen dark, it was an act of faith, loading a secret weapon they did not understand into the breech of their guns. That faith was first tested on Christmas Eve, 1944. Near Bastogne, General Patton's Third Army was clawing its way north to relieve the surrounded 101st Airborne. The 776th Field Artillery Battalion was ordered to support the 4th Armored Division's attack. Their target, a concentration of German infantry from the veteran 5th Parachute Division, dug in on the approaches to the city. The fire mission was called. Howitzers roared, sending the first volley of posit-fused shells arcing into the winter sky. The American forward observers, watching through their binoculars, were prepared for the familiar sight of ground bursts. What they saw instead was breathtaking. The shells didn't strike the earth. One after another, they vanished in a series of sharp, violent flashes in the air, perfectly timed, about 30 feet above the German positions. A storm of steel shrapnel rained down vertically onto the exposed infantry. The effect was immediate, and for the observers who knew what normal artillery looked like, utterly shocking. From the German foxholes, it was incomprehensible. A veteran Lancers knew the sound of incoming fire, knew how to survive a barrage. You hug the earth, you get below the horizontal blast, but this was different. The shells were exploding in the sky, with a precision no timed fuse could ever achieve. A German officer from the Führer Begleitbrigade later wrote, "The Americans have developed an artillery shell that bursts in the air at treetop height and showers the foxhole with splinters from above. Losses from this have been heavy." The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical one. Cover was useless. The foxhole, the trench, the slit in the ground, the infantryman's only sanctuary, had been rendered obsolete. German morale, already strained by the stalled offensive, began to crack. Soldiers gave the new weapon a name born of fear and confusion: magic shrapnel. For them, the very air had become an enemy. Reports of the fuse's incredible effectiveness flooded up the American chain of command. General Maxwell Taylor, whose 101st Airborne was being defended by these new barrages, was an immediate convert. Patton, a lifelong believer in the power of artillery, demanded every fuse he could get his hands on. On December 26th, he sent an urgent message to Schaeff. "The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating. I think we have a battle-winning weapon." The initial strict limitations evaporated. Eisenhower authorized the fuse's use across the entire front, wherever the tactical situation warranted it. By early January 1945, American artillery had been transformed. It was no longer just a powerful weapon of suppression, it was a brutally efficient killer of infantry in the open. For the German ground troops, it created an almost insurmountable obstacle, a curtain of steel they could not hide from and could not pass through. The fuse was a tactical masterpiece, a war winner on the frozen battlefields of the Bulge. But its stunning success only deepens the central mystery. If it was this good, why was it kept under lock and key for 4 years? To understand that decision, we must look beyond the Ardennes and up into the embattled skies over the Third Reich. The answer to that mystery lay not in the forests of Belgium, but 20,000 feet in the air, over the industrial heart of the Reich. The VT fuse was, first and foremost, the ultimate anti-aircraft weapon. Allied strategists lived with a constant nightmare that a single unexploded shell would be recovered and reverse-engineered by German scientists. If they could replicate the technology for their vast network of flak batteries, the Allied strategic bombing campaign, a cornerstone of the entire war effort, would become prohibitively costly, perhaps even impossible. For years, the calculus was cold and clear. The safety of the bomber fleets was a strategic necessity that outweighed any advantage the fuse could give the infantry. The Ardennes was the breaking point, the moment the immediate threat of tactical collapse finally eclipsed the long-term strategic risk in the skies. The Ardennes was not the end. On New Year's Eve 1944, Hitler launched his final gamble in the West, Operation Nordwind. In the Alsace-Lorraine region, German divisions once again massed for a surprise attack against weakened American lines. But this time, American artillery was fully prepared. They unleashed a devastating combination of technology and doctrine. Using a technique called time on target, multiple artillery battalions coordinated their fire so that hundreds of shells would land in the same instant. Now, those shells were all armed with the proximity fuse. For the attacking German infantry, moving across the frozen fields, the effect was apocalyptic. Entire assault formations were caught in the open as the sky above them erupted in a single, crushing wave of perfectly synchronized airbursts. It wasn't a barrage, it was the systematic annihilation of an attack at its most vulnerable point. The offensive was shattered before it truly began. The German winter offensives were broken. Their infantry power bled white in the snow. The mysterious shell from the sky had played a decisive role. And now, it is time to solve the mystery from our opening scene and finally look inside that 4-pound nose cone. Inside that 4-pound nose cone was a marvel of miniaturization, a complete Doppler radar system. A tiny vacuum tube, powered by the shell's own spin, transmitted a continuous radio wave. As the projectile neared the ground, the reflected wave's frequency shifted. A highly sensitive circuit was engineered to detect one specific frequency shift, the one that corresponded to a height of approximately 70 feet. At that precise instant, it closed a switch, detonating the main charge. This was the answer to the German soldier's terror. The attack came from directly above, a vertical storm of steel that rendered his foxhole useless. After the war, General Patton would call the fuse a pivotal contribution to Allied victory. It didn't win the battle single-handedly. It was a force multiplier. It took the Allies' greatest conventional strength, their immense artillery and industrial capacity, and made it exponentially more lethal. The war's most effective secret wasn't a new kind of explosive or a revolutionary weapon system. It was something far smaller and far more clever, a tiny radio that taught every old shell a new and terrible trick.